The Overcoat by Nikolai Gogol, another 19th century allegorical tale of horror like Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown, but based on Tsarist Russia's bureaucracy, corruption, and rigid hierarchy. There was a heightened awareness in Russia during Gogol's time, not only of the plight of the downtrodden, but of an increased sense of the importance of helping lowly clerks by making their work more efficient and, in that way, diminishing the overwhelming nature of the bureaucracy, which stifled their efficiency and their productivity. Gogol's protagonist in the story is a little man who relishes, really even loves, his work as a copier, and only faces obstacles when they are thrust upon him by the lawless who prey upon him or by the higher officials who are supposed to help him. The story is framed by the real and the supernatural. Gogol is considered the father of Russian realism, that is, employment of mimesis and verisimilitude, or creating a story that reflects real life. However, this story has comedic elements as well as surreal and fabulous dimensions. It's also a scathing satire of Russian bureaucracy and its Byzantine hierarchies of power and position. We all came out from under Gogol's overcoat. That's a statement that has been attributed variously to Turgenev, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky, though its actual source may have been a turn-of-the-century French critic. What it shows, however, is the impact this story had on Russian writers. And it had a great impact on Western storytelling in general, and continues to hold sway as one of short fiction's masterpieces. One can best understand a story like Gogol's from not so much a doctrinaire Marxist view, but more what we would call a neo-Marxist perspective, like that of the British literary critic Terry Eagleton, who saw a character like the downtrodden one in the overcoat as signifying someone victimized by what Eagleton called the superstructure. Superstructure means simply the institutions that existed and made up the entire social and economic fabric, as well as the cultural gestalt, that is, the parts of the system as well as the entire system itself. And all of that really created history. So this takes us, the idea of the superstructure, into an understanding of a story like The Overcoat, because we can look at this story from the perspective outside of the text, to the institutions, to the zeitgeist, which means the spirit of the times, to really the historical period in which Gogol lived and wrote this masterpiece of a story. This is at the core of understanding much great Russian fiction, I should add, whether it's by Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Pushkin, Turgenev, or Chekhov, the most important figure of them all as far as the short story. A major critical way into a story like The Overcoat is by looking at the superstructure, which carries with it a view of the historical period and what amounts to a dialectical analysis. Dialectic originally being a term from Hegel, but ultimately identified more with Marx, who wrote about feudalism as the thesis and conflict with capitalism as the antithesis, and for Marx the synthesis was socialism. The system of feudalism, and at its core serfdom, would be emancipated under the more egalitarian reforms of Alexander II, 21 years after Gogol wrote The Overcoat. But the liberal reform movement in Russia began under Peter the Great, and it was making headway in Russian consciousness onto the canvas of Russian writers. Suddenly, seemingly inconstant of Tsar Nicholas, the autocrat, perhaps because autocrats wanted a more efficient bureaucracy. Certainly Nicholas did. Let's look at this central character, or this protagonist in Gogol's famous story, Akaky Akakievich. His name means actually dung on the shoe. He's a common man, like Hawthorne's Goodman Brown. But perhaps, as the author and short story writer Frank O'Connor has noted, the first little man in fiction, a Russian schlemiel, the kind of archetypical character upon whom the soup accidentally spills. Now, this is a Yiddish photo. He's really visible is that he's teased by the younger clerks who work with him. Let me begin the story of The Overcoat and give you a sense of Gogol's prose style, but also of how he writes in so many ways that are really masterful and curious at the same time. He begins by saying, in the department of, and then there's an ellipsis. He says, but I had better not mention which department. You can see, living in an autocracy, how one can be afraid perhaps of mentioning a department, one can be afraid of bringing attention to oneself. He's also bringing attention to the kind of fiction that was making itself apparent at this particular time in Russian history, and really throughout Europe and the Western world. But he goes on to say, there is nothing in the world more touchy than a department, a regiment, a government office, and in fact any sort of official body. It's as if he wants to impress upon us just how important these departments are, really in terms of how they see themselves. And that kind of self-importance really manages to play its way into the story in a way that we find particularly compelling. It's not to say the collection, which is usually described as hemorrhoidal. Nothing can be done about that. It is the Petersburg climate. This is the first time he introduces the climate, which plays a very central role as a kind of antagonist in the story. As for his grade in the civil service, for among us a man's rank is what must be established first, he was what is called a perpetual titular consular, a class at which, as we all know, various writers who indulge in the praiseworthy habit of attacking those who cannot defend themselves jeer and jibe to their heart's content. So there we have a little bit of jeering going on at the writers. And there's this self-consciousness of the narrator coming in and saying things to us in a way which we find later on in the novel, in Fielding and in Richardson, and really the birth of the English novel, to be commonplace. The now gentle reader, that sort of thing. But here's a character who needs a new overcoat. And he goes to his tailor. The tailor's name is Petrovich. And Petrovich tells him his coat can't be repaired, urges him purchase a new one. After much privation and sacrifice and the benefit of a holiday bonus, Akaki is able to buy the overcoat, which takes on a central and preeminent importance in his life. In fact, the clerk above him throws a party. You can imagine this, a party in honor of the fact that he has a new overcoat. They're honoring the acquisition of a general, a person of consequence, as Gogol calls him, who winds up excoriating Akaki for not following the hierarchical chain of power and showing off, in fact, in front of one of his friends and how powerful and authoritative he can be. Akaki falls sick, and soon after, he dies. Well, the story concludes with what is ultimately Akaki's ghost or corpse, depending on the translation, taking people's overcoats and ultimately confronting this person of consequence to take his overcoat. The narrator, at the end of the story, tells of another ghost with immense mustaches like those of Akaki's attackers. So we have a story of a little man, a satire, insignificant man facing a world of government jobs, rank, police, district commissioner, corruption. And like Hawthorne's Goodman Brown, Akaki is an everyman. He's small, humble, meek, an underdog. But his life changes and is transformed, though only temporarily and ephemerally, so much of his life into acquiring, get it back or get some sense of justice. It's a story for which it's almost impossible not to feel pathos. Gogol was often ridiculed. In fact, disparagingly, he was called the mysterious dwarf. And I think he projects some of himself onto the little man Akaki, makes his character a writer, man of words, though a copier. Herman Melville's famous story, Bartleby the Scrivener, is also about a copier. Though Bartleby the Scrivener is the character who simply says, I prefer not to, and says it over and over again, and finally becomes almost catatonic. Akaki, when he has that overcoat, feels joy, maybe for the first time in his life. Not to say that he doesn't like being a copier, because he does. He actually takes great pleasure in copying. But what we see is, in both these stories, a kind of parody of the role of the writer. Bartleby the Scrivener was published 11 years after The Overcoat, in 1853, but it mirrors The Overcoat. And probably, in some ways, as famous a story as Bartleby is, couldn't have been written had it not been for The Overcoat. What Gogol creates in the story is a mythic little man for us, a man virtually, as I said, unnoticeable throughout his life, who even when he initially began his life, did so with a sour visage at his christening. The story is set up to contrast the little, seemingly inconsequential man to the general, the man of consequence. In other words, the dichotomy of the powerless and the powerful. And the powerful treats Akaki scornfully, unconscionably, but then experiences regret and guilt. As I said, teased by his classmates, called the mysterious dwarf. But some of those earlier experiences certainly probably helped shape and account for his empathy for a character like this hapless and much ridiculed Akaki, who was teased, as I said, by his fellow clerks. Gogol, like many writers of short fiction we're going to be studying, wanted initially to be a poet. And one can see poetic intensity in his work, especially in The Overcoat. He had a close relationship with the great Russian writer Alexander Pushkin, and was deeply affected by Pushkin's death only 3 years before the publication of The Overcoat fiction, like Poe and Hawthorne. And he produced novels, drama, and satires, as well as short fiction. And one sees in The Overcoat a wealth of detail and a self-conscious narrator who makes us aware of the fact that he's telling a story and feels bound to follow certain specific rules he believes apply to the craft of novel writing. Now, as far as the detail, when we meet Petrovich, the tailor, we find out that he had, well, a plaster kitten with nodding head. Or we find out that there's a general's picture on a snuff box and one of the eyes are poked out. These kind of details one doesn't see in earlier stories, but one begins to see in stories by Gogol and by Chekhov, stories that were written by Russian writers. One also doesn't necessarily see until now this sense of trying to follow specific rules. That is, I should mention a character, the author says to us, or the narrator says to us, but if I do, I feel duty-bound to say something about that character that's specific. There even may be a hint of satire about writers in Gogol's making his narrator so overly concerned about keeping some data confidential and following certain strictures about what should or shouldn't be included about a character. Let's get a feel, again, of The Overcoat, particularly as we come to the conclusion. I read the first few opening paragraphs, but when you get to the end, we've moved into the supernatural realm. And here again is the sense of a narrative voice that's very strong. It's not like the voice of Poe's Montressor, who's a character who plays a role in the story, or it's not even like Hawthorne's voice, although that is an omniscient voice as well. But see if you can hear the language here, despite the fact that it's translated, and what it summons and what it evokes. What was even more remarkable is that from that time on, the apparition of the dead clerk ceased entirely. That is, from the time that he took the person of importance overcoat from him. Apparently, the general's overcoat had fitted him perfectly. Anyway, nothing more was heard of overcoats being snatched from anyone. Many restless and anxious people, with good reason. These apparitions are something to be afraid of. They're out there haunting the Russian landscape, or at least haunting St. Petersburg's landscape. Now, there are universal themes in this story. The character is isolated, and that isolation shifts briefly to his entering the world and finding an identity with his new coat. When he has that new coat, the self expands briefly beyond to a sense of richness of objects, of color, of social life, even eroticism. Akaki has a couple of drinks and the impulse to run after a lady. What I mean by universality in this is the sense that one can suddenly come from a low position and have a moment that seems triumphant, that seems joyful, that can open up the senses, open up one to life as one has never been opened up before, and really Gogol captures this masterfully. Akaki goes in this new sartorial self, that is outwardly dressed in his overcoat, from being the schlemiel that I mentioned before to a swift experiencing of happiness as opposed to being this unlucky character. Some of you with a good memory for Little Abner may remember in the comic strip Little Abner there was a character that Al Capp, the creator, gave us who had a cloud constantly over his head. And certainly Akaki was that type of character. His life before the overcoat was defined by his great self-sacrifice, and he wears it, and then what happens? He's accosted, he's beaten, the overcoat is stolen. Ultimately, the overcoat, notwithstanding its wry humor and its satire of Russian life and Russian bureaucracy, is really a story about human suffering and sacrificing for a goal that is tenuous, evanescent at best. Held all too briefly, though happily, but also lost all too easily because of the evil men do. How profoundly sad that St. Petersburg, the mighty antagonism of the Northern Frost. The characterization and the sketches of individual characters are really extraordinarily detailed, as we've seen never before, really. And the narrator, self-conscious, fastidious, obedient, a character in his own right, a kind of Greek chorus almost in some sense, who feels obligated to follow these rules of how to write, whether he's eschewing the indecency of mentioning undergarments, which he does, or complying with the supposed rule in novels that characters need to be complete. The story are really nothing short of remarkable. Fantastic. The tailor's misshapen nail, the portrait of the general on the snuff box, good examples of the sure touch that Gogol has with detail. The fantastic ending Gogol alludes to of what he calls this perfectly true story, he insists on it being true, is what Vladimir Nabokov called a tale for the creative reader and of social protest for the Bolsheviks, communists, a comedic tale of horror and the supernatural that paradoxically creates a feeling for humanity at the same time that it spells out in detail the things that appear at the end of the tale, Akakis and the mustache figure whom we meet in the encounter with the policeman, remain part of a fantastic tableau of the phantasmagoric. Pushkin, Gogol's mentor, may indeed deserve the laurel of being the father of modern Russian literature and its greatest poet, but Gogol established a different form and voice for the short story with the overcoat and was a figure of colossal importance and influence on all of the great Russian writers who followed and stood on his shoulders.